No jokes in the back. Would you please do what I'm going to do right now is reach out and turn off the ringer on your phone. It can be silent or whatever, but we do not want to interrupt our recordings for the KKFI thing if you can't see it like I can't. Anyway, I'm with the Forum Committee. The Forum was created for the discussion of significant issues of the day and even controversial topics. And today we have with us Seft Hunter, who has a significant discussion about where you live and the dangers of your zip code. So here you are.
Good morning, good morning, good morning. So when he said the introduction was going to be short, I expected it to be just a little longer than that. Come on now. I'm joking. I'm glad, absolutely glad that it was very short. Sometimes it can be a little odd to be a witness to your bio being read in front of you. So thank you so much for not doing that, and I really appreciate the brevity of the introduction. And good morning to you. Really glad to be here. My name is Seft Hunter, and I'm the Executive Director of CCO Communities Creating Opportunity. And CCO is a faith-based organization founded almost 40 years ago here in Kansas City. And within this role, I get quite a number of invitations. Unfortunately, not all of them I can say yes to, right? But Theo, where's Theo? Here's Theo. Theo was, I got to tell you, put Theo on the case when you want a certain speaker to show up, because Theo will not relent, right? Theo is the Garmin of seeking out that speaker and ensuring that he or she is present at the appointed moment and certainly at the appointed time. So thank you so much, Theo, for creating this opportunity for me to be standing here this morning. Not necessarily, I often don't talk about this, but just a quick word on my background, given the topic that we will share this morning and then the conversation that we'll have following. I'm originally from Jamaica. And so my father came to the United States in the 1970s as a migrant worker, right? And so he came to pick southern crops, and so oranges and pecans. And then eventually he made his way from Florida to the east coast of the United States, so around Maryland, West Virginia area, where he picked apples, right? And he was what we call now an undocumented person, but back then they didn't bother with those niceties. They just, in every ounce of the pejorative, referred to him as an illegal alien, right? And I often will be very intentional with that frame because it best described his status in the country at the time. So here is someone in his late 30s, early 40s, in this strange place at this strange time in the history of this country, with no rights, absolutely no rights. Nor did he have any recourse to petition for any rights because he physically was not here. I mean, he was physically here, but literally wasn't here when we look at the kind of the laws and the structures at the time. Fast forwarding a bit, my father got amnesty in the early to mid 80s from President Reagan, the last time we had what I might point to as sane immigration policy in this country. And that very singular change in public policy, that one change in public policy set my life and the life of my 7 other siblings on this very, very different course. So I had the opportunity in 1989 to come to the United States, right? And I came from rural Jamaica to a fairly rural part of the United States, Martinsburg, West Virginia, just in between. It's like the eastern panhandle of West Virginia, in between like Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. So it's right there in that area. And I got to tell you, as a young person, I had the opportunity to remember what it was like to look at the United States from the outside, right? And I should confess that much of what I learned about what it meant to be American and the experience of Americanness in many ways was shaped by 80s soap operas, right? So Dallas, Falcon Crest, right? And as a child, I had this unrealistic, unrealistic expectation of what it meant to be American. My idea was that Americans were always dressed up, going somewhere, not really knowing where, but they were always dressed up all the time, because that is what I saw on television, right? I never really saw people really working, but just seemed like they were just going places, having lunch, right? Looking very dressy all the time. You know, now and again, someone would have a coma, right? And at some point, someone was shot. I think it was possibly JR, right? But details. Now, flying to Baltimore, Maryland in 1989, in the middle of February, right? Imagine February here in Kansas City, and probably subtract about 10 degrees, all right? And so, as a kid coming from the tropics to the United States in the middle of February, I can remember wearing this short sleeve shirt. It had diamond patterns. I don't know how I remember that. But I can remember walking from the jetway into the airport and having this sensation that I'd never experienced in my life, this chill, this incredible cold. But the most important thing was recognizing that the images that I saw on television differed, significantly from the reality that I then experienced on the ground. Right? Jamaica is a class-divided society, right? Being a former British colony, class, title, education, position, lineage were the most important ways in which we delineated ourselves, right? Still just as painful as race, but in many ways qualitatively and quantitatively different. I had the opportunity to serve in the military. I was in the Air Force, right? I got the opportunity to get the GI Bill, right? I got the opportunity to get an ROTC scholarship. I got the Pell Grant. And so I got all these wonderful opportunities that in many ways are the kind of collective promise of what it meant, what it means, and what we aspire for it to continue to mean in this country as it relates to the accessibility of opportunity. What I've come to learn is that those opportunities are not universally available, right? And in part, what we'll talk about here this morning is what does that mean practically for folks here on the ground in Kansas City and across the country. And so that's a little longer introduction than I normally give, but I do think it's important to kind of set the stage for some of the things that we'll talk about this morning. Now, so CCO as an organization was founded in 1977, interestingly, the very year that I was born, right? But it was founded here in the Blue Hills neighborhood, which is just a little bit south and just a tad east from where we sit right now, right? So imagine like where Rockhurst University is, right there in that neighborhood. That is the Blue Hills neighborhood. And so 40 years ago, if you imagine like what was happening here in Kansas City at the time, we were going through, some significant issues of the kind of continued vestiges of racial segregation and economic opportunity being delineated by one's race, similar to how it was happening in the country. So we were not unique, right? But in the 1970s, the issues of racial redlining and blockbusting, two real estate practices that really denied the economic aspirations of people of color in this city and also in this country. So when we talk about racial redlining, right? So racial redlining is kind of like a banking practice, right? That says, hey, if you're on this side, you're good, right? But if you're on this side, don't even try it, right? So it's basically kind of taking a map and drawing a line, a red line in this particular case, and saying that in the communities of color, those individuals would not have access to mortgages, would not have access to home equity lines of credit. I don't know if those existed at the time, but would not have access to many of the kind of banking tools that provides a set of resources and pathways for home ownership, home maintenance, and the kind of building and maintenance of one's value that we commonly tap into our homes. So that's racial redlining, right? Now, blockbusting is a related practice, but not the same, in the sense that blockbusting is basically using racial fears to change the makeup of communities, right? So our office is at 24th and Troost. Just outside my window is Beacon Hill. It sounds new, but it actually isn't. Beacon Hill is an old neighborhood in Kansas City. For many, many years, many decades actually, it was a mostly black neighborhood, right? Now it's almost exclusively a very, very white neighborhood, right? The home values in that neighborhood are heading north of $500,000, right? Which we want values to rise in homes. We just want it to be equitable, right? So we don't, we definitely want everybody to be able to participate in that system. So imagine what folks did, right in the middle of the 1950s, 1960s, and also through the 1970s, was to use racial fears, right? So what they would do is, real estate developers would hire African American women in some cases to push a stroller through the neighborhood, right? And make it very visible, right? Make a big show of it. So imagine the day when most people would be out cutting their grass, probably Saturday morning, right? Or they would call people on the phone and will ask to say, is Johnny May there? Or they will use kind of stereotypical black names, right? To give the idea that black people are moving in these neighborhoods, and then would use the constructed reality of that to then force people to sell their homes at very depressed values, right? What they would then do is they would then rent or use, contract for deed structures, right, to get African Americans and others to be temporary occupants, right, of those homes at fairly exorbitant prices, right? Remember, the land itself is not moving, right? The land itself, let's take Beacon Hill in this case, is still situated in the shadow of downtown, right? And so while at this momentary period, the values have been artificially deflated, right? At some point, those values are going to go back up, right? And so that is the practice of blockbusting, used to great effect in Kansas City and around the country to change the racial makeup of communities, right? And to really kind of reconfigure the economic, kind of structures of the city and of the country in many cases. And so CCO was founded in a period right at the height of that in the 1970s. We were founded by a priest. We were founded by a Jesuit priest, right? The late Father Norman Roderick. And he was someone who really wanted to live into his faith in public life. And so faith was just not what was contained in then Catholic social teaching, right? But it was about this kind of physical presence. It was a way of being in community and in relationship with people. So this very ambitious Jesuit priest founded two organizations. He founded CCO, Communities Creating Opportunity, but then he also founded the Blue Hills Community Services, which is a community development corporation, right? And so in one entity was developed to build the physical infrastructure of a community, while the other was CCO was developed to focus on how do we build people? How do we build leaderships? Because we can get that sidewalk in place, we can fix those houses, right? But eventually someone will need to be there as the kind of collective keeper of the consciousness that made that development necessary in the first place. So at some point, that development is going to fall into disrepair, right? And who will be the individuals who will be there to say, this still matters, right? So two organizations working in tandem. So that's actually our the basis of why we were founded. Now, when we look at the history of race in Kansas City, it also mirrors the history of race in America, right? So this is not a unique phenomenon to Kansas City. Now, we're not absolved because of that. We're still highly culpable, right? But I just want to point out that what we were looking at here in Kansas City also mirrored almost exactly what was happening in other cities like Milwaukee, like Chicago, like Atlanta, and other cities all across the country, right? And so we are here very close to Country Club Plaza. Actually, some might say this is, depending how creative you want to get with the marketing, right? This might be, an extension of the plaza, depending on how you want to count it. And that is critically important when we consider, for example, the role of J.C. Nichols with not just in developing kind of racial covenants and restrictions here in Kansas City, right? That made very explicit that, hey, if you're in this area, you must belong to the Homes Association. No choice. If you're buying in this area, you must belong to the Homes Association, right? And those homes associations will be very explicit that only white people are welcomed in those communities, right? And so J.C. Nichols really kind of developed and cultivated that structure here in Kansas City, and then he went on and took it national, right? And so many of those what are called CCNRs, or the kind of covenants and restrictions, basically made very explicit exclusion of people of color in many of these communities. And so imagine being an African American person in Kansas City or in this country, right? And you might have some economic mobility depending on your profession, depending on your education, but you cannot live in that neighborhood simply because you're not white, right? That is the reality of some of the kind of formal structures, right, that basically engineered the racial configuration of the city, right? Now, we would want to believe that this is historical in nature. And depending on who you are, that may be a reality and a message that you want to proliferate. That this happened at some point in our very far history of the city, right? But as I'll point out later, the very same communities that were excluded then, right, are also the communities where we're likely to see the most devastating outcomes, right, as it relates to so many factors. So historical, yes, right, but still predictive of the patterns of disparities that we see today, and we will talk about that, right? Now, we talked about racial redlining, very, very important, right, because the communities that were redlined then are also the communities that we're likely to see still the most devastating outcomes still today, right? And so if you're adding this up from where you're sitting, part of what we then must be aware of is what are those systems and structures, right, that are created, right, and then perpetuated over time to deliver to us at this moment the patterns of disparities that exist right here in our city right at this time. Right? And so we cannot look at our history in Kansas City and the history of economic exclusion and racial exclusion and said, okay, well, that happened back then. Right? It is predictive. It is absolutely predictive of the patterns of disparities that exist right now. So take, for example, the Easter Troost community in which I live. I live in Manheim. All right? Manheim is between 39th and 47th, Troost and Paseo. So literally just east from where we are right now, right? And in neighborhoods like Manheim and surrounding neighborhoods, the unemployment rate in 1968 and the unemployment rate now is projected to be only about 2 percentage points difference, right? The rate of home ownership, right, in 1968 and the rate of home ownership now are almost identical. Right? So when we talk about history, right, let's be mindful of that frame because in some ways it may give indication to a place from which we are not currently, right? But I would argue that the historical frame in Kansas City, the historical structures of racial segregation and separation really does provide the most powerful explanatory lens to understand current patterns of disparity. So we will talk about that. Okay, so our model as NCCO is one in which we seek to be a pathway, whereas people of faith, broadly defined, can have a pathway of how collectively we can participate in public life, right? We work from explicitly a racial lens. Right? And oftentimes I'm in community spaces, right? I'm in congregations, some mixed, some exclusively white, some exclusively black, but the message is still the same. right? It is the message of one where we have to challenge ourselves to say the differences and disparities that exist. Are those differences consistent with our shared values as a people, right? And depending on your tradition, is it consistent with whatever faith or values tradition that you hold, right? That is the question that we have to ask ourselves, and that message doesn't change if I'm here or if I'm at the Baptist church down the street, right? We also have to look at, this reality of really looking at, like, how do we build power, right? So when we talk about, for example, the racial wealth gap in Kansas City, which we'll spend a little time talking about, right? When we talk about the differences in life expectancy, right? We got to be mindful that it was a set of policies. It didn't happen by accident. It was a set of policies, right? It was a set of policies that basically created these structures, perpetuated these structures, and continue to maintain those very same structures, right? And so if that is true, right, then there is then an opportunity for us to deconstruct, right, to sweep up the breadcrumbs that have delivered us to this location, right? And so by then we have to be clear then on the issue of power. And so if let's say, the patterns of disparities that exist are inconsistent with our shared values, then we have to build enough power to change those structures that are giving us these outcomes. And if we can't do it, if we're unable to do it at this point, we have to be clear that there is, in fact, a deficit in power, right? And a working definition of power then in this conversation has to be the ability to change the structure. So if we can't change the structure, we do not have enough power, right? We can't get Medicaid expanded in Kansas, which we didn't at the end of this last cycle. We have to be clear that we do not have enough power, right? If we're in a society wherein, families can be separated at the border, right? And those policies are allowed to exist and be perpetuated, right? We have to be clear that we do not have enough power. Now, we might have the ability to complain, but we don't have enough power yet. So let's be clear, we must become literate in power, right, if we're going to change the structures that are giving us the differences in life expectancy, that are giving us the lack of access to healthcare and the lack of access to economic opportunity. Yeah? So that is our model then as an organization. Now, I'm not sure if some of you can see this from where you are, but don't worry, right? I will talk you through it. And so in my previous profession, I used to be a professor, right? And in that role, so when I left that role, I used to work in health sciences. So I spent a lot of time as a researcher looking at the built environment and health. So how do, for example, the presence of sidewalks, the presence of streets and trees and parks impact the health of people, right? Don't worry about not being able to see the map. I'll walk you through it, right? But in essence, when I left that role to come to organizing, I thought, I'm going to leave all that behind, right? I'm just going to focus on protests, right? We're going to raise a little hell, right? We're going to shake things up. Little did I know, the maps and all this data would follow me to this very place, right? And so the maps that you see in front of you, and I can email those out. We can make them, get them in your hands if necessary, right? But what these maps show are a set of geographies. So we're all here in Kansas City. We're all from Kansas City generally, or the surrounding area. So the geographies that I would lay out to you would be the geographies in dark blue, right? So let's just take a second and locate 12th Street, 9th Street, 12th Street to the north. Let's call it Independence Avenue, right? To the north, right? Go all the way then to 75th Street towards the bottom there, the dark blue, to the south. Troost, just on the other side of these walls. Troost to the west, and then the highway to the east, right? That is the geography that is generally low life expectancy. But these specific areas would take us to roughly about 75th Street is what we're seeing there at roughly around the bottom. Now, those geographies have an unfortunate set of similarities, right? And that is the communities there in dark blue, and then their neighbors, so us right here to the west, right? There's a difference of 13 to 15 years in life expectancy. 13 to 15 years. So imagine if some of us can or would want to go to the top of this building and look east, right? And in the line of sight, so what we can see from this building, we can see in our line of sight individuals who will live a decade less than us, right? So take a second and think about it. What were some of the things you were doing a decade ago? What were some of the things you were doing a decade ago? Theo, what were you doing a decade ago? Let's make this a little interactive. What were you doing a decade ago, Theo? If you can share. Yes, what were you doing a decade ago? Find somebody else. All right, so sir, right in front of me. You know what? I can tell you're not Baptist because you're all the way in the front. Everybody else, we're not sure what denomination you're coming from. But this gentleman's right up front. So what were you doing a decade ago generally? Okay, so you were in Washington, and then what were you doing there? Oh, you retired then too? Okay. So were there anything that you particularly enjoyed doing while you were there in retirement? Okay. Yes. Yes. Yeah. So a decade ago, you were in retirement in Washington, enjoying the very green Washington, right? The fresher air than probably Kansas City. So you were in retirement. How about you, ma'am, in the back in whatever color that is, the peach or teal? Yes. What were you doing a decade ago? Self-employed graphic designer. Are you still a self-employed graphic designer? Aye. That's right. That's right. Excellent. And ma'am, in the green, the very bright green there, you're just calling for me to call out to you. What were you doing a decade ago? Teaching. What subject? What subject? Reading. Okay, so the most critical of subjects, reading. And so I often will ask folks to think about this because imagine if whatever that was, whether it was a time with your spouse, time with your kids, time with your church, time with your community, imagine none of that existing, right? And when we look at the very stark difference in life expectancy, right, in essence, we're having folks who are dying a decade shorter than their and not there, but our adjacent neighbors, right? So that is the difference in life expectancy. Again, part of what I pointed out, we have to look at this as a continuation of racial segregation in Kansas City, right? Because the very same communities that were, the very same African American communities that were segregated are the places in which folks are living a decade shorter. Right? So imagine we're seeing cycles of poverty. So grandma was poor, daughter is poor, granddaughter will likely be poor if not for some intervention. Right? And so the structures remain. Grandma didn't own, daughter doesn't own, granddaughter may not own anything. Right? Because in many of these communities, what we see are high rates of rentership. Right? In my own community now, we're in the middle of getting gentrified, just between friends here, right? In Manheim, when I first moved there a decade ago, it was roughly around 85% renter, right? 85% renter, and so in many ways, the very bodies of people of color, right, were really used as placeholders to hold those properties until the actual owners, who are majority white, decides that, hey, the values have gone up enough that we're going to sell. And that's exactly what we're seeing in neighborhoods like Manheim. That's exactly what we saw in neighborhoods like Beacon Hill, right? So when we're renters, we don't get the tax deduction. We don't get any of the benefits that come with home ownership. We're also not rooted in communities in the same way, right? And so the decade of difference in life expectancy is, one, a recognition of where we need to build more power, right? But it also is a recognition of issues of economic lack of economic mobility, right? So race is predictive of these spaces, right? And also the economic despair, so the lack of folks having reliable economic pathways, right? And that actually are those two factors, race and economics, are probably the most powerful predictors of differences in life expectancy, right? We can point to things like transportation. So we look at the broader city as a map, and we think about, where do we see the most significant rise in economic opportunity? It's north by the airport and then over in Kansas, right? Imagine trying to get to any of those spaces without reliable access to transportation. We've mapped it. An intern from UMKC mapped this out, and in essence, you would have to get up maybe at like 3 a.m. to get to like an 8 a.m. job out in Lenexa or up by the airport, right? And so the structures and systems that exist delivers reliably these disparate outcomes. So a decade of difference. You can almost take any demographic, and it actually is exponentially worse in the communities in dark blue. So in education, for example, roughly around 40+% of ninth graders will drop out before graduating high school, right? We look at, for example, the issue of access to early childhood education. Only about a third of the kids in this zip code would have some access, don't talk about quality, but some access to early childhood education that focus on critical things like early literacy at a time when the brain is being developed and at a time where such access can actually make a difference, right? And so the demographics, right, the structural barriers that exist for people who live in this community are almost insurmountable when you think about it. And so what happens, what it means to be here then, is this sense of perpetual despair, right? How this manifests, let's say, for example, in one zip code, right? Zip code 64128. And just to locate that physically in our minds, it would be at Linwood and Troost, right? And head east. So when you get to the highway is where zip code 64128 picks up. Roughly about a quarter of young males of color in that zip code will not live to see age 30, right? Because of the high incidences of gun violence, right? And it's not because folks who live there are any more violent than anybody else. But imagine being in this space, right? Wherein there is no opportunity to look to tomorrow because it is not clear what tomorrow will hold, right? It is not this question of you say, tomorrow I will, right? And some of us, we could take that for granted, but that is not the reality that exists in that zip code and zip codes like it. And so this particular configuration, this geography, for many folks does reflect an unfortunate, but a destiny that is defined by despair, right? It is one in which folks have not been able to point to any period in the past of where they had any hope of escaping the circumstances in which they exist. Or when they look to the future, there's also no hope of where individuals will be able to escape the circumstances in which they exist, right? And let's be clear, it is in a city where the unemployment rate in Kansas City writ large is under 4%. In many of these communities, the rate of unemployment is probably closer to 25%. When we look at the number of individuals who aren't even counted because they haven't had a job for quite some time and they've just frankly given up, right? The question that as a city, as a community, as a congregation, that we have to wrestle with, is this a system, right? Is this a structure that reflects our shared values, right? If, let's say, you're able to answer reliably the question of where breakfast came from today, where lunch is going to come from in a short while, right? Can you just say that, hey, I'm good, right? I have mine, I'm good, right? I don't have to think about those for whom that is not the same reality that they're experiencing right now, right? And so the broader question that I have to place to you, and we have to wrestle with together, right, is what are we actually called to do in this moment, right? What are we called to do in this moment? Right? What are we called to do in this moment? Can we be comfortable in whatever privilege we have, right? While we know that that is not the reality that our neighbors, that our brothers, and that our sisters are experiencing at the very same moment. So when we look at the issue with zip codes, the demographics really do tell an incredibly, desperate story. It tells a story that really should challenge all of us to be a lot more introspective, to challenge all of us to think about, can we be a part of a collective response that is about lifting up the narratives of these communities and also being a part of a practice of changing the systems and structures that are delivering to us in an unfortunate yet reliable way these devastating outcomes, right? The demographics are just an indication of why we see the inability for folks to break out of these structures, right? Now, we talked about a number of these. So the barrier of education, roughly about 40% dropout rate. We have a practice of economic exclusion in the city, wherein we can predict the level of economic investments in communities of color, primarily because of the history of how that of how we've seen economic patterns really play out in Kansas City. We also know that as it relates to access to capital, that is a significant issue, right, for folks who live in these communities because of the high concentration of payday lenders, right, which here in Missouri, they can charge upwards of 1,950%, right? That is the legal limit that our state legislature has pointed out that can be allowed. Now, the APR, or the annual percentage rate, is roughly around 455%, right? And so imagine that at a moment when you can possibly afford to maybe lose around 3 to 5% of whatever meager earnings you have coming in. Imagine at that very same time, you are in an economic configuration where you will lose about 40% of it, right? And so folks who get caught in payday loans can maybe afford to lose about 3 to 5%, right? Because they're already in a fragile economic state. But when you look at the rates of interest and the fees, right, the fee structure, they're losing roughly around 40%. Many of those individuals are caught into multiple years of this predatory cycle of indebtedness, right? And that actually is happening right here in our state. It is happening, within, a very short distance from where we sit this morning, right? Also, on this question of power, we also see rates of civic participation of people of color on the decline. Now, we saw a sharp spike in 2008, black president, right? But then decline, right? And in a cynical way, we could say, okay, well, black people don't care about democracy. Black people just, we're just going to sit this out, right? But we know that, obviously, I'm being a little crass. We know that that is not true. So if we take a second and we think, if, let's say, some of us are in a position of where we can demand that the sidewalk in front of our house be fixed, we can collectively demand that the city ensure that there's lighting around our congregation so we don't have to go out in the dark, right? We can demand that the garbage be picked up on Tuesdays and that the recycling, you get an extra bin for the recycling, right? So we can make a set of demands through which we can, with some reliability, predict that our government is going to respond, right? Now imagine if you're in one of these communities and what you see every single day is elevated violence, lack of access to economic opportunity. Then what is your rationale? What is the critical invitation for you to come out to vote? Right? Why should you participate in the system? And so rates of civic participation at a time when it needs to increase, it is actually on the decline. And I think in part, we have to attribute it to the lack of responsiveness and the social and economic conditions that exist in these communities. Now, when we look at then how do we end these cycles, right? So ending on a prescription for what we can do together, right? I would argue in many ways in the same way that Eric Liu, former speechwriter for President Clinton, argues, and that is we must become literate in power, right? We must become literate in power. And some of us, when we hear power, we get scared, right? We might have been exploited at some point by this issue of power. But collectively, I would argue that the power that we need to build is one in which we have enough power, we have enough ability to change these structures, right? So literate in both the use as well as in the kind of broader understanding of power. I would also say that we have to and must create systems in which we have early investments in early childhood education. Right? So at that critical moment when the brain is being developed, we must ensure that every child, irrespective of geography, irrespective of place, irrespective of race, gets the opportunity to have critical learning opportunities, right? I would also say that we must be clear that the system of predation that exists in the city, that exists in the state, and in some ways that exists in parts of this country, we must collectively disrupt that cycle. We know what happens is that these structures deny the economic aspiration of communities, predominantly women. Roughly around 60% of folks in payday loan structures are women, and those tend to be women of color. So women who experience any kind of change in life circumstances are at the greatest risk of getting caught in payday loan structure. And we must disrupt those cycles right here in our city and in our state. Finally, I think we have to begin to kind of ask ourselves, what are we called to do in this moment, right? What access, what opportunity do we have to act individually as well as to act collectively, right? To really work to disrupt these structures and to disrupt these systems, right? I got to tell you, as I close, in part, one of the things I recognize is in my previous profession, I was often called, as a professor, you got to come with some answers, right? But what I'm recognizing in this role is that there's great power in questions, right? And so the ability for transformation may not happen in one conversation. It may not happen in this space, but we have to challenge ourselves, right, to wrestle with these questions. It is not enough to be able to answer predictably that the things that you need to extend the very basic of human dignity to yourself, that you can answer reliably that those things are in place. We must be collectively concerned for the folks for whom those individuals cannot answer in the affirmative in the same way that you can. And it is not about taking anything from you. It is not about, asking you to live less comfortably, but it is about how do we collectively raise the floor? How do we raise the floor so individuals in our city, children in our city, aren't in kind of constant discernment and question around where the very basic of safety will be provided, where food will be provided, and where shelter will be provided. We must argue collectively that that is not consistent with the city and the country and the world that we collectively want and must exist in. And I think with that, I'll pause for your questions.
Well, would the ushers come forward and take up the collection for the church? And let me remind you, we need short questions because we're going to have limited time. And then also, please make no statements. If you have a statement, you can come to the library afterwards. And Seth has decided he would spend some time with us in the library, and we can hear comments then.
I work with a neighborhood group in what is Quality Hill, if you know where that is.
I know where that is, yep.
One of our big concerns is the fact that rents are going way up in that area. And we feel that the people who are mostly going to be displaced because of those increases in rent are going to be people of color. So where are these people going to go? And are rents also increasing substantially in the dark blue zip code areas that you've been talking about?
Yeah.
Can you discuss that a little bit?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question, and the answer is yes. Yes, rents are increasing in the dark blue areas. I'm pointing to it as if it's right in front of us. Yeah, so rents are increasing in those dark blue areas, and what happens to folks in those places where rents are being increased, then they're pushed further east, right? They're pushed further east into communities where the housing stock is in greater disrepair, where there's higher violence, and where there's less access to some of the things that are being developed. So take my neighborhood, Manheim, as a case, right? 10 years ago, it was mostly black. Now it's probably about 50-50. And, every new resident in my neighborhood over the last 2 years have all been white, right? Now, I believe in inclusion. I believe in being in a place where, we live and have to, get the opportunity to be in relationship with folks that are different than ourselves, right? So this is not an argument for having, exclusive neighborhoods that are exclusively one race or the other. But to your point, what's happening in the city is that, folks like in communities like Manheim are getting pushed to the east at a time when safety is increased, at a time when you can now walk to, let's say, a restaurant or a coffee shop, or the time when transit is really good on Troost, right? Individuals will get pushed further east and will then have to be in a community that is less safe and has less access to resources. Now, to your point around Quality Hill, we used to have, and not used to, but we can't. There are examples of where individuals introduce rent control practices. New York is most famous, probably have some of the most developed structures, but I think we can look at models wherein we're able to say, hey, let's get some protections in place to ensure that we can maintain a level of diversity in these communities. Now, in Manheim, one of the structures that we use is a structure called low-income housing tax credits, right? And it's a state and federal configuration, and we have an expert here in the pew behind you who could probably spend a little more time talking to you about it. But it's basically using state and federal dollars on housing projects that then predicts and restricts the significant rise in income. So in Manheim, for example, we have 2 to 3 structures that have used this kind of financing mechanism, and it basically ensures that over 15 years, possibly 30, as the contours in Manheim, for example, will change, folks can maintain and have affordable rents in those housing practices. So, long and short of it is we cannot simply hope for the kind of diverse communities that we want, right? We have to be able to use a set of tools that ensures that we have it, right? Simply hoping is not enough, because, the kind of developers and others are using a much different, structure, and it's all about the bottom line, right? Which, hey, I'm in favor of people making money, but we also have to say, if we want to be in a community that is diverse, if we want to be in a community that reflects the broad fabric of our community, then we have to use structures to demand and ensure that that is the outcome that we get. Other questions?
So I'm on a mailing list, and one day they just started coming from Seft Hunter, and I didn't know the background because I'm not that involved, and I've made come over and made calls, even though I live in Roland Park, on issues sometimes, phone banking. So I wanted to ask about the last opportunity for that, which had, to my surprise, different, and I read into it some, maybe not enough, different opinions on what the pre-K proposal, on the value of that pre-K proposal, and what's your opinion about the next step on getting pre-K education improved?
Yes. Do we have teachers or educators, broadly defined, 1 educator, 2, possibly 3, maybe? So we had a reading coach. I definitely assume that your heads would go first. But the questions around pre-K and what then is the next step, right? So we were invited on the last election, municipal election, around a conversation around how do we extend early early learning opportunities. And, to the community, it was a structure that would rely on a 3/8 in sales tax as the mechanism of how to fund it. We know that there were a number of folks who believed in the need for pre-K, but disagreed with the structure of how it should happen, right? And there are always lots of opinions and points of view, and I think that is the beauty of democracy, right? And we can absolutely all disagree, but what remains true is the rationale for that conversation, and the lack of access to early childhood opportunities still exists for many families, right? We know that it's roughly around only a third of 3 and 4 year olds in Kansas City, right, will have access to high quality pre-K. Right? And we know that the primary reason is due to the very high cost. It is between $10,000 on the low end, $12,000 on the average end for what the cost of pre-K would be. So an accredited pre-K with a curriculum that we know will prepare kids for kindergarten and beyond. So it's a very low number of families who can afford that, right? And so you would almost have to make, as a household income, you'd have to be probably in $80,000 or more a year to afford that for one child, and then everything else, insurance and car payment, and you'd have to be probably in $80,000 a year to be able to afford that reliably, and that's with one kid. Now, imagine what happens for families who have more than one child, and so it becomes incredibly difficult, right? The issue, as we all know, did not pass. But I do think we have to recenter the conversation, right? This issue was not intended to be a kind of protracted fight between parents and community and then school officials, right? That is not a tenable fight. And to win in that fight would have meant that you would have to kind of separate parents from their kids' teachers, and that is not. That's generally a hollow prize, right? And so what we have to do is recenter the conversation. What we have to do is keep an open mind and recognize that, hey, we need to find a solution to this, because the lack of access to early childhood delivers predictably the outcomes that we see here on this slide. Yes, ma'am. Oh, Theo.
I'm sure you paid close attention to the ideas of our upcoming mayor contenders with respect to their plans to lift the destiny of despair. So might you share some of your observations?
Yeah, and so I'm endorsing. I'm joking. No, we actually don't. We're a 501c3, so we don't endorse candidates, nor do we want to, right? But what we do, what I think we do have to do is to seize this opportunity to invite folks into a conversation around how we lift the floor as a city, right? So the two contenders, Jolie Justice and Quinton Lucas, have served in government from various degree and tenures, right? And so in some ways, they've been in the system. And if we really want to take it a little further, by extension of how long they've been there, they partially own some of the outcomes that we see and continue to see here. I can tell you that what we see in this city, especially as it relates to policymakers, is a tacit acceptance that this is normal, right? Folks accept that this is normal because it is not what they see. It is not what they experience on a daily basis. So this is accepted as normal. This is the outcome of 50 plus years of despair, right? And so mayors, governors, legislatures after cycles accept that this is normal, right? And I think in this particular conversation for mayoral candidates at this particular time, we have to invite these folks into a different way of being, in which we can't just say, okay, yes, I'm going to visit East of Jerusalem, but we have to demand a different set of responsive actions on the part of the next city council, the next governor, and the next mayor of the city. When we look at the city budget that came out on Valentine's Day, this past February, right? It basically accepted this as normal, right? No additional money for a mentoring program in zip code 64128, where a quarter of the young males of color will not live to see age 30, right? And 2/3 of the city budget went to public safety defined by fire and police, right? So that's roughly around 75% of the general funds in the budget will go to public safety, to which the ability of a young male of color to live to see age 30 is not included in that conversation around how we have a responsive, kind of framing of public safety, right? And so the moment requires us to enter the conversation in a different place, whether it be anger, whether it be agitation, but whatever it must be, it has to be an orientation in which we do not accept this as normal. And unfortunately, that is the paradigm in which we exist right now. Next question. Okay, all right.
Wasn't that great? First of all, I want to give our honorarium, our official coffee cup, Union Made, Made in America honorarium for speaking at the forum. And he will be in the library shortly. And I had a number of questions, but I refrained. I'll discuss them in there. The next week's forum will be on solar panel or solar energy in the Kansas City area with our own Rita Norton and our own George Haig, who have had two different experiences, but similar experiences of installing solar panels in their homes. So I'm looking forward to that. And all of you are welcome to stay for the church service here shortly at 11:15, and we'll be in the library. Thank you.